Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Eerie News, and today is November 23rd, 2024, Saturday, November 23rd, 2024. We're a few days out from Thanksgiving here in the United States, so to everyone listening, happy Thanksgiving. And let's get off to our first story out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, and it's titled Where You Came to Die. In the far reaches of the largest fjord in Norway, perched on the side of a mountain, is a 16,000 square foot castle overlooking the town of Luster. For all its fairy tale appearance, when it operated as the Lister Sanatorium, this was the place where many came to die. The sanitarium was constructed in 1902 to be used as a hospital for terminally ill tuberculosis or TB patients. The location was chosen due to the risk of contamination posed by the tuberculosis bacterium. The sanatorium was built to hold about 120 patients, and there was an average two patients for every employee who also lived on the premises. The patients were isolated from the outside world and moved to the mountain because it was believed the fresh, crisp air would lessen their symptoms. From the steamship quay in Lister, there was an electric cable car up to the sanatorium. Later, a 4-mile road with 13 hairpin turns also led up to the hospital. Between 1902 to 1958, when it was repurposed, approximately 15,000 patients passed through its doors. It was the largest TB hospital in Norway. Until the introduction of antibiotics in the 1940s, patients were treated with fresh dry air, and plumage of the lungs and removal of ribs. The average stay at the sanatorium was 4 to 5 months. Lister was public and open to patients of all age groups and socioeconomic subsets of society. About 250,000 Norwegians died from consumption between 1895 to 1955. Quote, TB can damage lung tissue, creating additional surfaces for other respiratory pathogens to attach and impair recovery and the immune system. Due to improved living conditions and diet, natural selection, and efforts to reduce contact with infectious cases, TB began to decline by 1800. There was a spike during the Russian influenza pandemic in 1889 and during World War I, which was tied to the 1918 pandemic. This was due to a shortage of medical care, overcrowding, and conversion of latent to active infection. Throughout the years it was open, the complex was expanded by several buildings to make it as self sufficient as possible. Electricity was provided from a private water turbine. There was a chapel with a morgue, post office, laundry, ice house stables, and a pig farm. Separate housing was built for the doctors and nurses, two family houses for stokers and gardeners. In 1959, it was converted into a psychiatric hospital and renamed to Harastollen. Most of the patients were displaced from their hometown of Bergen due to a forced closure of the local asylum. Many patients tried to commit suicide due to their mental illness. They constructed a fence on the staircase to prevent patients from jumping down to their death. The asylum closed in 1991. In the 1990s, it was used to house about 340 asylum seekers from Bosnia and Herzegovina. Conflicts arose between the immigrants and the local community, in which the refugees complained it was worse to live there due to its remoteness than from where they had fled. The once modern, thriving hospital was left to the elements, the process of decay taking its toll on the exterior and interior of the building. It is no surprise that the building is said to be replete with ghosts and residual hauntings from the time it would house those hoping for a treatment of a disease that was incurable, and then for those whose brain was diseased. There was also the isolation of this place, which many perceived as a type of exile. Screams, mutterings, and distant conversations, along with footsteps, are heard, especially in the staircase that had to be fenced off in order to prevent suicides. Strangely, little has been published about the morgue and the amount of deaths that occurred at the sanatorium and later the asylum, which was an inevitable thing considering sick people were housed there. It's almost as if they were forgotten in death as much as in life. In 2015, the site was used as a movie set and was visited by urban explorers and legend trippers. After being closed in 2021, the new owners plan to renovate the building to be used as a hotel, initially with 30 or 40 rooms. Today, the sanitarium is inhabited by people working on rehabilitating the old structure. but who knows how many of them, of the non living, still walk the hallways. Let me tell you something. When this place opens up as a hotel, that'd be an interesting place to go visit if you can make it. And it's very interesting that the refugees, it's apparently to get to this place, it's difficult. 13 hairpin turns, or because from what I understand, this cable car, which was initially the only way to get up there, it doesn't work. So it makes you wonder. At one point, yes, there was the fear of contagion, and I'm sure they repurposed it for asylum, not for the not for the fear of contagion, but because it was there. But it makes you wonder. Yes, I'm sure. I know there were crazy people there, but how much of what was going on had to do with the remoteness of the place. But yeah, I believe. I'm not sure. I believe it hasn't opened yet as a hotel, but they're repurposing it, but going in that direction. Very interesting. I'm sure that that's one place like you could like go and maybe have a weird encounter. Okay, next story is also out of Strangers in Fiction stories, and this is titled A Ghost Named Lucy. The area of West 44th Street in New York City was just a patch of farmland and forest in 1792. The American Revolutionary War had ended less than 10 years before, and maybe events that took place then caused the ghost that eventually became known as Lucy Ryan to haunt this area. After the Revolutionary War, New York City grew, and by the 1800s, a road was laid down in what would eventually become 44th Street. In 1862, a brick townhouse and cottage occupied the lot, and within 10 years, it was up for sale. The neighborhood was originally named Clinton, but through the years, it became a slum known as Hell's Kitchen. In 1917, John J. O'Donnell, a 41-year-old bachelor, lived in the townhouse and died after a short illness, but the house did not have any unsavory past, or at least none that was known of. The place was close to the theater district, which is perhaps why actress June Havoc bought the property at 428 West 44th Street in 1962. By then, she was an established film actress who had started out in vaudeville and was a sister of burlesque striptease performer Gypsy Rose Lee. The house had been renovated through the years, but by the time Havoc became an occupant, it still retained its Victorian appearance. She rented the upper floors to various tenants and lived downstairs because no one would renew the lease on it. She was soon to find out the reason why. Before long, June started to hear rappings on the kitchen floor at the magic hour of 3 a.m. She thought there was something wrong with the structure of the house and brought in a carpenter, a plumber, and an architect who found no problem with the home. June's maid also heard the tapping, so she knew it was not her imagination. Underneath June's apartment was a floor through apartment, but strangely, the tenants never complained of any noise. It was then that June started to believe that her house was haunted, and spoke about her experiences on her television show. Gail Benedict, who was involved in public relations, got her in touch with Hans Holzer. And his book, Ghosts True Encounters with the World Beyond, he described the investigation of June Havoc's home. He arranged several seances starting in January 1965. He brought with him the English medium and witch Sybil Leek. It did not take long for the ghost to make its appearance by tapping on floorboards in the rear of the house. The entire interaction was being filmed for June Havoc's television show. While visiting a small courtyard in the back of the home, Sybil Leek said a body might be buried close to the wall of the basement. Then she allowed the spirit to speak through her, and the lost soul identified herself as Lucy Ryan, who was 20 years old, and to her the year was 1792. She complained of being very hungry. When asked how she had gotten there, Lucy described herself as a camp follower of the Army in Napier's regiment. She said she couldn't leave because of too many soldiers, and that she was making noise because she wanted to get food, meat, and corn. Lucy described where she had been abandoned by a soldier named Alfred, who left her in the care of another man. Sybil Leek ordered her to leave, and she refused, transferring the tapping from the kitchen to June Havoc's bedroom. Research was completed regarding the information given by Lucy the ghost, and it turned out Colonel George Napier, a British officer, had served on the staff of Sir Henry Clinton. The Clinton mansion had once occupied the area where June's house was at now. Holzer had investigated other ghostly manifestations at Clinton Court 2 blocks to the north. It turned out that Napier had been in charge of a regiment from 1778 to 1780, at this very place where he served as a captain. It was especially noted in the history books that Napier's wife Elizabeth Pollock and their daughter Sarah Elizabeth had contracted yellow fever while living there and both died in 1780. Their other daughter, Louisa Mary, survived and died in 1856. Colonel Napier took a surviving child and left for England, where he married Lady Sarah Lennox in August 1781. The area where the Napier family had lived and died would eventually became a potter's field. During a second séance on January 15, 1965, Lucy was again channeled through Sybil Leek. She gave Alfred's last name as Bailey, and that she was waiting for him since he told her he would return. The group tried to cross Lucy over, but instead of leaving the tappings, they were now heard throughout the entire apartment. A third séance was conducted in March 1965. Under trance, Sybil Leek described where Lucy had moved on, but Alfred was still there. He was waiting for Lucy now. He described where it appeared several people were sick close to the river. Alfred described where people were hungry and cold and were buried in a pit. The activity quieted down considerably, and Hans Holzer cautioned June Havoc not to feel sorry for the ghost, and eventually all activity died away. She lived there until 1969. Let's go to the actual history. It wouldn't be the first time that ghosts come through with dates that are not on the mark, such as the case with the story of Lucy. This information also disputes dates supposedly researched and reported in Holzer's book. The information given that Alfred Bailey served under Napier could not be possible. However, the year of 1792 does not. The information given that Alfred Bailey served under Napier could be possible. However, the year of 1792 does not. Captain Napier, as he was known then, first married Elizabeth Pollock in 1775, and both of their daughters were born in Britain. He spent a brief 2 years in America before becoming sick and being sent back to England by Sir Clinton with his one remaining child. In 1781, he was already in Britain, where he married Lady Sarah Lennox, with whom he had 8 children. He did not return to America. Yellow fever reached epidemic proportions in 1795, 1799, and 1803, claiming thousands of lives over the course of its presence in New York City. Upon infection, most victims would experience headaches, followed by severe exhaustion, high fever, and slowed heart rate. This period was followed by remission stage and then by delirium. During the delirium stage, victims acquired a characteristic yellow hue on their skin and pupils. In final stages, a vomiting of black bile occurred and was followed by death. So, did the ghost of Hungry Lucy really exist? If she did, was she really a camp follower during the Revolutionary War, or a confused spirit who lost her life after a bout of yellow fever and was buried in the potter's field? Or perhaps she was just a made-up character to stoke the interest of June Havoc's TV audience, and a character in one of the many ghost books authored by Holzer. So there you go. Some of it corresponds, but Napier wasn't there when Lucy the Ghost talks about that. So maybe somebody got confused about the dates, but if you go by them factually, historically, they don't. That obviously that it became a potter's field and that there was a lot of people dead. That part, yeah. But by then, Napier had gone back to Britain. Okay. Next story, also out of Stranger Fiction Stories, is titled "A Killer in the Family." All right, and most families resist the possibility that one of their members is not only a murderer, but a serial sexual sadist killer linked to one of the most infamous unsolved murders of the 20th century. On a January morning in 1947, Betty Bersinger, accompanied by her 3-year-old daughter, came upon what she thought was a mannequin lying 10 feet from the sidewalk. She assumed this because a human figure sprawled on the ground had been bisected at the waist and was inhumanely pale. What she didn't realize was that the body was insanguinated. When she realized it was a dead woman, she called the police about what she had found on a vacant lot in what was then an undeveloped area known as Limerick Park. The murder victim was later identified as Elizabeth Short. Her face had been slashed at the mouth from ear to ear, giving her what is called a Glasgow smile. There were cuts all over her body, rope burns, and defensive wounds on her wrists, hands, and ankles. One of her breasts had been cut off. There was no blood around the corpse, leading police to believe she had been drained of blood somewhere else. Once the body was examined, it was determined that someone with medical expertise had killed her. Shortly before the death of Elizabeth Short, the Blue Dahlia, a noir film, was released. Veronica Lake and Alan Ladd starred in the popular movie, which was still playing in the theaters. Photos of Elizabeth Short wearing a black dress were sent to the press after the notorious crime, and it was then the Herald Express dubbed her the Black Dahlia, a name that gave her the fame that eluded her in life. A name that was linked with the Black Dahlia was George Hodel. George Hill Hodel was the only son born to Russian Jews George Hodel Sr. and his wife Esther Loff in 1907. He grew up in Los Angeles and graduated at the age of 15 from high school. He enrolled at the California Institute of Technology, Caltech. However, a year later he was expelled due to a sex scandal. Turned out that the teenage Hodel had impregnated a professor's wife, and her marriage fell apart after it became known what had transpired. When he was 20 years old, he entered into a common law marriage with a woman named Amelia Lawson, who used the surname of Hodel. They had a son named Duncan in 1928. Starting in the 1920s, Hodel overindulged in alcohol, used hashish, opium, and stronger drugs. He graduated from Berkeley Pre-Med in 1932. Around this time, he married Dorothy Anthony, and they had a daughter, Tamar, in 1935. He continued in his medical studies at the University of California, where he received his medical degree in 1936. He married Dorothy Harvey, John Huston's ex-wife, in 1940. They would go on to have 3 children together, Michael, Stephen, and Calvin. In these years, he became head of the county's Social Hygiene Bureau and moved in affluent LA social circles. He surrounded himself with those who were interested in partying, drinking, womanizing, and sadomasochism. His good friend was surrealist photographer Man Ray. Designed by Lloyd Wright in 1926 in the manner of a Mayan temple, Soudan House became the hotel residence in 1945. This was the same year Ruth Spalding, the secretary at Hodel's First Street Clinic, which treated cases of venereal disease, was found dead of barbitol poisoning. The death of the 27-year-old was ruled a suicide, supposedly precipitated by the end of the affair she was having with Dr. Hodel, but police suspected she was murdered. The motive being that she knew his darker secrets, and whether she had threatened to divulge what she knew, or he feared she might, he had done away with her. Not only was the patient information he held sensitive, it was later learned he performed abortions, which in 1950 was a felony punishable by state imprisonment. Considering what went on behind the walls of Soudan House for the 5 years Hodel lived there, perhaps it wasn't coincidental that it was modeled on a culture who were known to offer human sacrifices in order to appropriate their deities with blood. George Hodel's granddaughter and great-granddaughters refused to go inside the house in later years, claiming that they were afraid of the events that had transpired there, especially in the basement. By the time of Elizabeth Short's death, Hodel, though legally married to Dorothy or Dorero Hodel, had brought to his home Amelia, his first common-law wife, with her now adult son, Duncan, as well as Dorothy Anthony and Tamar. He also had casual lovers, one of them being the unfortunate Elizabeth Short. It's theorized they met when she visited his First Street Clinic. In 1949, Hodel was accused by his daughter Tamar of sexually molesting her and impregnating her with a child that was aborted. He was acquitted when Tamar's mother testified that her daughter was a liar, despite 3 witnesses testifying that they saw Dr. Hodel engaging in intercourse with his daughter. Afterward, the 14-year-old Tamar was sent to a juvenile detention home. Having escaped the accusations of his daughter, LAPD intensified their investigation against him for the murder of Elizabeth Short, which was fast approaching its 3rd anniversary. He was already a suspect, but now authorities planted recording devices to capture evidence they could use to indict him. It wasn't until many years later that his son Steve came across the transcripts of what was recorded, which included a woman screaming at his father, stating to an unknown person, quote, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead," end quote. In 1950, as these events swirled around George Hodel, his wife Dorothy had grave doubts about her husband, and according to Steve Hodel, she sent a telegram to her ex-husband John Huston, which read, quote, "Your hunch about George true. Can you help children and me get out of the house? Today if possible." End quote. Sensing that his luck and protection in the City of Angels was coming to an end, in August 1950 he left to Hawaii. He married Hortensia Laguda in 1951, and by 1953 he was living in the Philippines, which he would call home for the next 40 years. Hodel's marriage with Hortensia produced 4 children, but it also ended in divorce. He traveled regularly back to the United States, maintaining ties with his sons. In 1990, he returned to the United States and married June Hirano, who was 39 years younger than him. Dr. George Hodel died in 1999 at the age of 91. Ironically, one of George Hodel's sons, Steve Hodel, went on to become an LAPD homicide detective. After his retirement, he started to investigate the story that his father had been the killer, with the hopes of clearing his father's suspicion. However, the more information he uncovered, the more he realized he was finding clues that inevitably led to his father being a very dangerous individual. Steve Hodel believed his father slaughtered the Black Dahlia in the basement of the Sowden house. He later verified that his mother and brothers were absent for 3 weeks, visiting his uncle during the time of the murder. He also linked him to murders that occurred in Manila after his father moved there, which involved corpses that were dissected and posed the same as the Black Dahlias. Steve Hodel has written books concerning his years of research, which convinced him that his father was the person who killed Elizabeth Short. He described a telling clue based on the way she was killed. Quote, "The killer had performed a hemicoroptomy on her. Hemicorporectomy. Okay. It's a unique procedure that was taught at medical school in the 1930s when he was there, where you cut between the second and third lumbar vertebrae. It's the only way you can divide a body without cutting through bone." End quote. Steve Hodel believes that based on his research, his father is linked to the Chicago lipstick murders that were committed in 1945 to 1946. One of the victims was a 6-year-old girl who was bisected, the same as Elizabeth Short. All these murders pointed to someone with a knowledge of human anatomy. Throughout the years, Steve Hodel has come across more and more evidence confirming that his father was a true-life Jekyll and Hyde. In 2008, he found documents which dated from 1947, in which a direct link between 50-pound cement sacks left at the Sowden house by workers contracted by Lloyd Wright for renovations to identical paper cement sacks used by Elizabeth Short's killer to transport her body parts to the vacant lot just 5 days before. This is hard physical evidence connecting items from the Hodel residence used to transport the body to the dump site. End quote. Steve Hodel believed that his father was a nihilist, a misogynist, and a sadist of the highest order, who identified with surrealism as an expression of his inner world. George Hodel's peculiar actions continued even though he had moved to another country. Tamar Hodel, who accused her father of molesting her at the age of 16, went on to have a child out of wedlock, and gave her away claiming that her baby was fathered by a black man. The child, named Fauna Hodel, did not discover that this was a total fabrication and that both of her biological parents were white until many years had passed. Fauna grew up in poverty in a town named Sparks, which is just outside of Reno, Nevada. Her adopted parents were a maid and a shoeshine man. Her black mother was named Jamie Lee, who was an alcoholic and was in and out of jail for fighting and prostitution. She was described by Fauna Hodel as being abusive, spurred by the fact that she knew her baby was only white, but nonetheless loving her. Fauna became pregnant when she was 16 and gave birth to a biracial daughter she named Yvette. By then she was haunted by knowing her true origins, since Jamie Lee had showed her a copy of her birth certificate with the name Tamar Hodel filled in as her mother. When she was in her 20s, Fauna Hodel was working at St. Mary's Hospital in Reno. She confided the circumstances of her birth to Sister Hilary, a nun she had befriended while working there. Sister Hilary went to St. Elizabeth's Hospital in San Francisco, where Tamar had been born, and went through their records, discovering that Tamar's grandfather was Dr. George Hodel. By then, George was living in the Philippines, and Fauna spoke to him by phone. She told him that she wanted to speak to her real mother. and he tried to talk her out of it, but eventually let her know that Tamar was living in Hawaii. In 1974, Fauna finally tracked down her mother in Hawaii and visited her there. She told Fauna about an incestuous relationship she had with her father, George Hodel. She had become pregnant by him when she was 12 years old but went on to abort the baby. She told Fauna that she was the product of a rape by a white man that was not George. Tamar's own children and mother warned Fauna that her birth mother was a compulsive liar and manipulator, which made her doubt if indeed her biological father was not George Hodel, and she never knew the true identity of the man that fathered her. Tamar Hodel might have moved on from the daughter she gave away, but her father George appeared to keep tabs on this member of the family throughout the years. Fauna Hodel wrote a memoir titled One Day Shall Darken. She described where she noticed she was being followed on different occasions. One time she saw a man exit a limo and stare at her and her daughter Yvette, and then turn and leave. Later, when she saw a picture of him, she realized it was George Hodel. During the mid 1970s, Fauna and her husband, William Billy Sharp, not only suspected she was being followed, but also that their home was being bugged, as they would hear strange clicking and echoes during calls. This suspicion became even more pronounced after an event that involved Fauna's cousin Johnny. She had not seen him in several years, and he unexpectedly called her asking if he could visit. She was surprised when he kept calling her baby and sugar, and that he wanted to feast his eyes on a sexy thing like herself. His speech was slurred, and he kept referring to when they used to play under the bed. Despite her misgivings, she agreed to his visit. During the call, she heard the strange clicking noises she had noticed before, as if someone was listening in. The day of Johnny's visit arrived, but Johnny didn't. Fauna then got a call from Johnny's sister Barbara telling her that Johnny had been murdered by drowning. At the funeral, she thought it was odd that the casket was closed until she found out that his body had been mutilated and his penis had been shoved in his mouth. Fauna and her husband wondered if the person eavesdropping on their calls was Johnny's murderer. Was this the work of George Hodel trying to protect Fauna? Or was George Hodel worried that she would uncover the secret that he had indeed fathered her, and would confirm him as the murderer of Elizabeth Short and others? Fauna Hodel died in 2017 and her mother Tamar in 2015. For the Hodel family, it was something acknowledged as the truth of who their patriarch, George Hill Hodel, was. Even George Hodel's great-grandchildren grew up being told that he had been the one to kill the Black Dahlia. As of 2024, Steve Hodel still believes his father was a serial murderer who killed not only Elizabeth Short but numerous other people before and after her death. So there you go. Well, you think, well, how can somebody get away with something like that for so long? You know, if you're connected, and then on top of that you run a clinic and you know all of everybody's secrets, as in who's doing drugs, who had a venereal disease, or if he did these illegal abortions, guess what, they cover for you. That's the way it works. When you know people's dirty laundry, and some of it was pretty dirty, think about it, they'll cover you. But I think that when he finally left to the Philippines, it's like no amount of, if you don't protect me, I'll talk about your stuff. That only is good for so long. And look, he died at the ripe old age of 91. That's usually the what's about some of these SOBs. I guess the lack of conscience allows them to live long lives. And then to boot, he marries a woman 39 years younger than him. I think to myself, apparently this man was very charismatic. Dangerous, but charismatic. Anyway, next story is out of Mysterious Universe, and this is titled Strange Cases of Haunted and Cursed Musical Instruments. Music has been with us since time unremembered. It is a phenomenon that transcends cultures and geographical boundaries, with every culture on Earth having some form of music. Ever since our first ancestors banged sticks upon rocks, our instruments of expressing this musical desire have evolved, to the point that now we have a plethora of musical instruments covering all manner of sounds and rhythms. These instruments, in a way, hold power over us, able to change our mood, our way of thinking, and even touch our souls. And in some cases, these instruments are even said to possess dark powers, being cursed, haunted, or both. One mysterious curse revolves around a bizarre instrument that you may not know of, and which nearly vanished from the earth, which is a glass instrument especially intriguing for the supposed curse it was said to have, with its sounds said to have rather mysterious and sinister effects on the listener. The practice of producing music through the rubbing of glass has been around since at least the Renaissance period and consists of filling glasses with water and rubbing one finger around the rim to make varying notes and tones to make music, with the pitch dependent on the amount of water in the glass. This form of instrument is known as an idiophone, meaning that it creates sounds through its own vibrations, without the need for strings or membranes of any kind. And in the case of using glasses, it is also often referred to as a crystallophone. This sort of music gained popularity in the 1740s when an Irish musician named Richard Pockridge toured London to much fanfare with his array of glass goblets, which he called his glass harp, and which he played to curious audiences up until his death in a fire that destroyed the unique contraption. Other musicians who made the glass harp popular were Christoph Willibald Gluck and Edward de Laval, the latter who just happened to be a friend and colleague of Benjamin Franklin. Intrigued with the use of vibrating glass to produce music, after watching de Laval played in 1761, Franklin went about trying to create a version of the instrument that was more elaborate yet easier to play. He enlisted the help of a glassblower named Charles James, and the two came up with a set of specially shaped glass vases that were arranged in a line similar to a piano keyboard, which was a radical change from the way the glasses had usually been played up until then. The 37 glass bowls were color coded corresponding to the pitch of their tones and mounted on a spindle, which was spun through a foot pedal. The musician merely had to wet the finger and touch the appropriate spinning vase to produce the desired sound, and it was all much easier and more precise than using the traditional upright glasses, allowing up to 10 notes to be played simultaneously. Franklin called his new invention the glasichord, after which he changed the name to the glass harmonica, which was derived from the Italian word armonia, which means harmony. It would also variously be known of as the glass harmonica, glass harmonium, bowl organ, hydrocrystallophone, harmonica de verre, harmonica de Franklin, and harmonica de verre, among others. Franklin would write of his invention thusly, quote, "The advantages of this instrument are that its tones are incomparably sweet beyond those of any other, that they may be swelled and softened at pleasure by stronger or weaker pressure of the finger, and continue to any length, and that the instrument being well tuned never again wants tuning." End quote. After the glass harmonica made its debut in 1762, its unique design and distinct, rather haunting and ethereal sound quickly made it popular, and for a time it was all the rage. Various musicians took up playing it, and there were efforts to further refine and evolve the design of the instrument, such as adding actual keyboards, utilizing absorbent pads to absorb excess vibrations for a clearer sound, or using violin strings instead of the fingers. During this period of extreme popularity for the bizarre instrument, many famous composers created music for the glass harmonica, including Baldassare Galuppi, Niccolo Gemelli, and such all-time greats as Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart in 1791 and Ludwig van Beethoven in 1814, among numerous others, and such shows were often played to sold-out halls. Other famous figures known to have taken to playing the instrument during this boom were George Washington and Marie Antoinette. Yet, for all of this popularity, there was a rumored dark side to the glass harmonica as well. Rumors began to spread that the surreal haunting tones put forth from the instrument caused a variety of problems in some listeners after prolonged exposure, including dizziness, headaches, fainting, nosebleeds, nausea, or in worst cases, permanent nerve damage, and that the music could induce deep depression, melancholy, suicidal thoughts, psychosis, and even stark raving insanity. Numerous harmonica players were also said to have been negatively impacted by the music, such as Marion Davies, a relative of Franklin's, who purportedly spiraled into depression shortly after learning how to play it in touring with her singer sister. The German musicologist Friedrich Rochlitz once recommended that the instrument not be played excessively, and never by those with mental illness or any hint of depression, and wrote of the glass harmonica's supposed sinister effects, quote, "The harmonica excessively stimulates the nerves, plunges the player into nagging depression, and hence into a dark and melancholy mood. That is, that is an apt method for slow self-annihilation." End quote. This reputation soon had people whispering that the glass harmonica was cursed, and it was often blamed for any misfortune of death of a player or persons listening to it, no matter how tenuous the connection. Although it is not clear just what extent any of these reported effects were real, there have been theories that could substantiate the claims somewhat. One lies in the nature of the instrument's sound pitch and its effect on human hearing. The glass harmonica typically produces tones in a range of 1 to 4 gigahertz, which is a weird range for our ears and brains as it is in a specific frequency at which the brain has difficulty triangulating the spatial source of a sound. This has a confusing, disorienting effect and might contribute to some of the symptoms reported. There has also been the theory that the glass used in the manufacture of the instruments contained lead, which could have led to lead poisoning in those who handled the glass harmonica. Lead poisoning was sadly rather common in the 18th and 19th centuries, and it has a whole range of unpleasant symptoms including headaches, irritability, memory problems, anemia, seizures, coma, or even death. Many of the effects the glass harmonica allegedly had could perhaps be the symptoms of lead poisoning, but at this point, there is little evidence to suggest the glass used had anything more than trace amounts of lead in it, and it is uncertain if just touching lead tainted glass would have been enough to cause lead poisoning in the first place. Whatever the reason for these rumors, it is thought that the talk of the curse was one of the reasons for the rapid decline in the popularity of the glass harmonica during the early 1800s. Other of the reasons included the fragile nature of the glass components and the fact that the instrument simply could not produce loud or bombastic enough sounds to fill the vast concert halls that were becoming in vogue at the time. The glass harmonica, with its ghostly, willowy sounds, simply could not compete with other more powerful instruments such as stringed instruments, brass, woodwinds, and percussion, and this was all made even worse by the evolving taste in music going on in the day. All of these factors conspired to make sure that by 1830 almost no one was playing the glass harmonica anymore. There were no more concerts, no new compositions, and the unusual instrument practically became extinct. In more recent times, the glass harmonica has experienced a slight resurrection, although there are only a handful of players and very few original specimens of the 18th and 19th century harmonica remain, mostly museums or private collections. Most of the instruments used now are imitations and recreations, so it is hard to say if their tones and frequencies are the same. Whether Franklin's glass harmonica truly had ominous effects or not is unclear, but it is nevertheless an intriguing tale of a mysterious instrument that nearly went extinct and a bit of odd history. A curious story of a haunted piano comes to us from back in the 1800s when Cornelius Butterfield and his wife Alice moved from England to Thistledown, Pennsylvania, for the husband's business. By all accounts, the young wife was not happy in her new life, and grew more and more homesick and unhappy by the day, and sought to find solace in playing the piano as she had used to in London, but her husband refused to buy her an instrument. The husband was apparently a cruel man in many respects, denying her wishes for a creative outlet, constantly verbally berating her for her poor cooking skills, and even by some accounts routinely beating her. She ended up going to a neighbor's house to play the piano, and she is described as playing beautifully, with her touch and voice both the finest and the sweetest I have ever heard, according to the friend. Her selections of music were also pieces that no one had ever heard before and that no one else could play, giving Alice a most mysterious ambiance. Sadly, Alice would die in childbirth of her daughter Pansy, although wicked rumors were circulating that the husband had had a hand in the death. This suspicion was only propelled when he promptly purchased a much larger residence as well as a luxurious grand piano, the very sort that he had long denied his dead wife. The estate was so large that Mr. Butterfield hired a cook and nursery maid and called upon his sister Elizabeth to come help him preside over the establishment. It was not long after this that ghostly phenomena started to orbit the new piano. The entire household would hear the piano playing at all hours, only to come down and find that the keys were being pressed by invisible fingers. And not only this, but the style of the nocturnal visitor was not only brilliant but was unmistakably like that of the late Mrs. Alice Butterfield. A report on the phenomena from Modern Ghost Stories by Emma May Buckingham, 1905, says of it, quote, the sweet notes trembled all through the house, thrillingly clear and wonderfully pure, closing with Mendelssohn's Wedding March. Brother and sister and maids rushed downstairs and stared at each other in alarm when they met at the door of the drawing room. They looked in and under the piano, then in every room and closet in the house, examined the windows and outbuildings, but no one was to be found. They took off the lid of the piano to see if a mouse could have set it to playing, or to see if a music box could have been hidden within it. Searched everywhere in vain for the performer. The following night it was the same, and so on for several nights in succession. Neighbors were called in and declared that the parlor was haunted. The servants left the house in fear. Still the grand Steinway awoke the inmates of the house nightly with its dulcet tones. The keys could be seen moving up and down, while marches, quick steps, bits of operas followed each other in rapid succession, now swelling like martial music, grand and glorious, again dying away to a whisper, then rising like the sound of a storm or furious battle. The first intimation we had of their parlor being haunted was when its owner asked Mr. Dory if his piano ever got out of order and played right on of its own accord, and when answered in the negative, told us why he had asked the question. He acknowledged that he was greatly puzzled, said he could give no solution to the mystery. He remarked that the keys were certainly manipulated by invisible fingers. Then, after a silence of a few minutes, the strangest part of it is that neither my sister nor myself are able to play this class of music, which we recognize as the work of the old masters, and the servants cannot tell one note from another. Our neighbors are unable to whistle a single bar of it, let alone playing it. There is not another instrument of the kind on our street. My sister thought that some wag had hidden a music box inside of the piano, but we have had it taken all apart, had it tuned over anew, and searched everywhere, but found nothing. It plays beautifully such music as I have heard my late wife play on her father's piano. End quote. Only when Mr. Butterfield passed away, the phenomenon stopped and the piano remained silent, almost as if Alice had been merely tormenting him from the grave. Moving on into later years, we have the tale of the haunted violin of Joseph Hornsteiner, which was supposedly originally crafted in 1769 for a king. It was an exquisite work of art, compounded of 365 separate, meticulously inlaid pieces forming its back, and it will go on to become into the possession of a collector of instruments named Harold Gordon Cudworth. In 1945, Cudworth began to learn that there was something more to this particular violin than met the eye, which he discovered while playing the tune The Broken Melody by Van Been. Cudworth would say, I was playing the instrument, which has a deep resonant tone, at my mother's home in Wareham, when suddenly a rumbling noise occurred, seemingly coming from the area of the kitchen sink. He stopped playing, and the droning stopped. But when he picked up again, the rumbling began yet again, even louder and more persistent this time, reverberating throughout the entire home. On the next evening he played again, and this time the rumbling started up along with alleged poltergeist activities, such as moving and flying objects thrown about the room. In the coming weeks he would resume his playing of the violin, the music divine, but every time the rumbling springing up along with all its manners of unexplainable events, always only while playing the broken melody, with a strange noise emanating from all around him and even heard by his mother. At one point Cudworth was playing the tune when the latch on his door shook with great might, and when he went downstairs the door to his room was slammed shut. Cudworth opted to play the piano instead, and found the sheet music for the broken melody sitting there upon it, placed there by hands unknown, as if urging him to keep playing it. In the ensuing days Cudworth went to give a violin lesson to a young girl, and opted to play the broken melody, with that bizarre otherworldly rumbling acting up right there in front of everyone, getting even louder and more intense than ever before, to the point that it drowned out the music. On other occasions, he was known to play the same song, and every time there was that rumbling and various moved objects about the room and swaying pictures upon the wall. It was enough to make him finally put the violin away and give up playing that cursed song, and it was never discerned just what the deal was that tune with that tune and the instrument. Codsworth would die in 1989, and the violin would be lost to history, with no one sure where it got off to. Another old ghost story, also invading violins, is the so-called legend of Violin Annie. The tale goes that in the 1860s, a young girl named Harriet Annie lived in the town of Centralia, Illinois, in the United States, and she was an avid, gifted player of the violin. The girl died at age 11, either from diphtheria or by being beaten to death with her own violin by her father, depending on which story you want to believe. But the end result is that her grave is supposedly very haunted. She was buried at a place called Elmwood Cemetery under a large gravestone bearing her image holding a violin, and it is said that if one is to visit her grave, they will hear the sounds of an ethereal violin playing. There have been some who have been claimed the statue of Annie was shed green tears during these ghostly musical interludes, and it all remains a piece of obscure local lore that might be pure urban legend, but which persists to this day. A rather weird tale of a haunted violin comes from the site Reddit, from a commentator who claims that they were actually in possession of one for a time. He claims that upon receiving this antique violin, he found that other instruments in the vicinity would be found knocked over or even broken, even though there was no one there who would want to do such a thing. And there were other strange phenomena orbiting it as well. The instrument itself is described as an 18th century Milan school model, and the witness says, quote, "Shortly after finishing this instrument and hanging it up in the humidity closet, something strange things began to happen. Lights would go on and off by themselves. My daughter would wake me in the middle of the night to ask why I was standing in her room. She told me she would hear someone talking, but not very loud, 2 weeks ago. I had guests who slept in the same room as the closet where the violin was stored. They told me that the touch lamp in the room kept turning on, and that after unplugging it, they were wakened by someone touching their shoulder, but there was no one there. The real kicker is that last week the electricity went off for a while, and while the family and I were downstairs, the door of the upstairs guest room shut, and we could hear faint classical music coming from upstairs. We do not own any battery-powered radios. After my last experience, I did not discount the possibility that the new instrument could have a spirit with it. I took the violin out of the closet and placed it on the entertainment center. I then played a CD that was only solo piano music. If I left the room to go upstairs, or if I went down to the basement, I and others who did not believe me could hear violin begin to accompany the piano music. And we went back to the great room. The violin music stopped as soon as we were in sight of the haunted violin." End quote. Lastly, we have the case of an account published on fine violins, which apparently happened in 2011 in the state of Minnesota to Andy Fine. It begins with a customer who came into the witness's violin shop to try some instruments out and fell in love with a German specimen from 1870. It seems that this would be the basis of the strangeness that would follow, as he describes. Quote, "I gave him several violins to play. After a short while, he kept coming back to one German instrument from about 1870. He kept playing other violins and then going, 'No, there's something about that old German violin that I really love.' Eventually, he played through all the violins and kept coming back to that one. He spent most of the afternoon playing it. As he did, I could hear his playing improve dramatically, and I could hear the violin opening up and really singing for him. At the end of several hours, Mr. D said, 'Wow, I really love that violin. I really love that violin. I want to buy it, but my in-laws are coming into town tomorrow, and then we're all heading up to the cabin. If it's still here in a couple of weeks, when I get back, I'll know it was really meant for me.' 2 days later, I was opening up the shop as usual at 10 a.m. I opened the door, and there was a violin that had fallen off the rack and crashed to the ground. The scroll was cracked. My heart sunk when I realized it was the violin Mr. D had really loved. Over the next few days, I did the best and fastest scroll repair I had ever done. I thought, I'll need to tell him about the damage. but it plays as nice and sounds as good as it did before. Maybe he'll be happy. I can't ask for as much money. Days went by, weeks went by. I didn't hear back from Mr. D. Another client played the violin and was interested in it. I explained how much Mr. D had loved the violin, and I wanted to at least call him before I sold it to anyone else. Luckily, the player understood. I called Mr. D's home the next day, and his adult son answered. I said who I was and asked to speak to Mr. D about the violin. His son said, "Yes, my dad was talking about the violin that evening, but I'm really sorry to tell you my dad passed away." I was shocked. He was a pretty healthy guy as far as I knew. I said, "I'm so sorry. I really liked your dad. How did it happen?" Mr. D's son, "Well, my dad went up to the cabin ahead of the rest of us to fix things up a bit. We got there at 10 the next morning. When we opened the door, there he was, dead on the floor. I again said how sorry I was and asked when that happened. His son replied, "Oh, it was just 2 days after he was at your shop." 2 days after he was in the shop? That was the day the violin that he loved had fallen off the rack. The violin that he really loved. I guess the feeling was mutual, and very close. And independently, both his family and I had opened the door, walked in, and there the violin were on the floor. Violins are certainly elegant, almost mystical instruments, with a long history and often used throughout the ages, heirlooms that seem to resist the pull of time. It is perhaps this quality that draws in these supernatural forces, or maybe it is just the almost larger than life air they hold about themselves, haunting sounds demanding a haunting atmosphere. Whatever the case may be, these are some undoubtedly spooky accounts of haunted objects, and one wonders just what may be at the root of them, or indeed, if they are even real at all. What article about haunted and cursed instruments could be complete without mention of haunted guitars? One notorious story is connected to not the guitar itself, but to the guitarist. In this case, we go back to 1967, which saw the formation of one of the most beloved and best-selling bands of all time, the British-American rock group Fleetwood Mac, which was originally founded by the original guitarist Peter Green. The group achieved phenomenal success throughout the 70s and 80s, with their breakout smash album being 1977's Rumors, which remained at the top of U.S. charts for 31 straight weeks, produced 4 U.S. top 10 singles, and sold around 19 million copies in the United States alone, and currently has sold over 40 million copies worldwide, making it the 8th best-selling album of all time. Fleetwood Mac has seen a lot of shuffling and changing of its members over the years, to the point that the only member who has remained consistent is drummer Mick Fleetwood. Yet while most of these departures and changes have been the normal evolution of a music group over the ages, one slightly spooky exception is a long series of bizarreness that has seemed to have befallen the position of the group's guitarist. The original guitarist, Peter Green, was forced to leave the band after doing too much acid in the 1970s, after which he was replaced by Jerry Spencer, who ended up getting strung out on mescaline and joining a weird sex cult in 1971. In 1972, another Fleetwood Mac guitarist, Danny Kirwan, had a bizarre meltdown on stage when he bashed his head on a wall and then descended into the audience to taunt the other band members. Kirwan would be committed to an insane asylum and would die homeless years later. As recently as 2012, the band would see the deaths of two of their guitarists, Bob Weston, who died of an aneurysm, and Bob Welsh, who committed suicide after losing the ability to walk. Indeed, the only Fleetwood Mac guitarist who hasn't seemed to have been plagued with death and misfortune is Lindsey Buckingham. A more modern account of a haunted guitar is the so-called satanic six-string, a nondescript guitar with a logo removed that would otherwise be pretty mundane if it weren't for the mysterious stories surrounding it. It is said that in 1979, a teenager owned a guitar who was into all kinds of macabre and occult practices. The posting for the sale of the guitar on the site Rebirth comes with a description that reads, quote, "A kid that lived on my street when I was growing up was rumored to be into devil worship, seances, Aleister Crowley, black magic, and other dark endeavors of the spirit world. I later learned that this neophyte necromancer was born on June of 66 and died tragically on Halloween, October 31st, 1979, when he was just 13 years old. His death has never been solved, but the calamitous kid was found lying on his bed with this guitar draped across him, apparently electrocuted, even though this is an acoustic guitar. Additionally, when the damnable corpse of this soulless stooge of Satan was eventually discovered, a 45 record of Blue Oyster Cult's Don't Fear the Reaper was playing repeatedly on the Mistopheles Moppet's GE Wildcat record changer. Years later, I ran into the Funk Boy's mother, herself a propagating practitioner of the pagan arts, and when I informed her that I was a professional guitarist, she offered me her devilish, daisy-pushing son's git fiddle. I've heard the strings discordantly ring out, despite no one being near the guitar. Further, on 3 occasions, I put the guitar in my bedroom closet, only to find the guitar on my bed when I return home, and I live alone. The final straw occurred when I saw the guitar levitate out of the trash can that I had somberly placed it in. It's better owned by someone more in tune with the tenebrous forces of the malevolent netherworld. Please use extreme caution when conjuring the phantasmic spirits that seem to be channeled through this iniquitous instrument. End quote. The price of the guitar was listed at $666, and it was snatched up by none other than the host of the TV show Ghost Adventures, Zach Bagans. Completely ignoring the warning in the description of the instrument, Bagans has said, quote, I don't play the guitar very well, but you can rest assured that I will most definitely play this instrument and see if anything happens to me. I was really blown away by the story behind the guitar and how the seller got the guitar directly from the boy's mother. Because of that provenance is why I jumped as fast as I could to buy the guitar. I was literally driving in my car when my phone started blowing up about the guitar for sale and was shocked when I was able to buy it, because the musician who had the guitar experienced so much with it, including levitating and playing by itself. I will display it securely at the Haunted Museum for close observation. End quote. The guitar can be seen at Bacon's Museum to this day alongside a menagerie of various other haunted and cursed items. Is it really haunted, or was this all a practical joke pulled off by the one who put it up for sale? Who knows? In the end, who really knows what the deal is with any of these haunted or cursed instruments? What we can be sure of is that music has held an important place in the human psyche for a very long time, and so perhaps, just as other things and places, it too can be infused with paranormal forces. So there we go. And I will be back with you soon for some more eerie and weird news. Like I said, of all the news that's floating out there, make no mistake, there's plenty of eerie news to go around. Till next time.